Hello and welcome to the Chatterbox Letters podcast. I'm going to be reading my very large chatter-like letter to my listeners. This book, aka Chatter Letter, is called Holes. I hope you will enjoy as I read Holes in audio format. I will be reading chapter by chapter, so it seems like it's interesting as you are curious to know the entire story at its entirety. Introducing Holes by Louis Sachar. I'm going to be reading chapters 1, 2, and 3 since chapters 1 and 2 are very short chapters. Let me put on my glasses. All right, let me get started. All right, let me get to those chapters. Here we go. Chapter 1. There is no lake at Camp Green Lake. There once was a very large lake here, the largest lake in Texas. That was over 100 years ago. Now it's just a dry, flat wasteland. There used to be a town of Green Lake as well. The town shriveled and dried up along with the lake and the people who lived there too. During the summer, the daytime temperature hovers around 95 degrees in the shade, if you can find any shade. There's not much shade in a very big dry lake. The only trees are 2 old oaks in the eastern edge of the lake. A hammock is stretched between the 2 trees and a log cabin stands behind that. The campers are forbidden to lie in the hammock. It belongs to the warden. The warden owns the shade. Out on the lake, rattlesnakes and scorpions find shade under the rocks and in the holes dug by campers. All right, let me go ahead. Next page. Here's a good rule to remember about rattlesnakes and scorpions. If you don't bother them, they won't bother you, usually. Being bitten by a scorpion or a rattlesnake is not the worst thing that can happen to you. You won't die, usually. Sometimes a camper will try to be bitten by a scorpion or a small rattlesnake. Then he will get to spend a day recovering in his tent instead of having to dig a hole out on the lake. But you won't be bitten by a yellow spotted lizard. That's the worst thing that can ever happen to you. You will die a slow and painful death. Always, if you get bitten by a yellow spotted lizard, you might as well go to the shade of the oak trees and lie in the hammock. There is nothing anyone can do anymore for you. Chapter 2. The reader is probably asking, why would anyone go to Camp Green Lake? That's my question, too. Most campers weren't given a chance. Camp Green Lake is a camp for bad boys. If you take a bad boy and make him dig a hole every day in the hot sun, it will turn him into a good boy. That was what some people thought. Stanley Yelnats was given a chance. The judge said, "You may go to jail or you may go to Camp Green Lake." Stanley was from a poor family. He never had been to camp before. All right, next page, which is chapter 3. Stanley Yelnats was the only passenger on the bus, not counting the driver or the guard. The guard sat next to the driver with his seat turned around facing Stanley. A rifle lay across his lap. Stanley was sitting about 10 rows back, handcuffed to his armrest. His backpack lay on the seat next to him. It contained his toothbrush, toothpaste, and a box of stationery his mother had given him. He'd promised to write her at the least once a week. He looked out of the window, although there wasn't much to see, mostly fields of hay and cotton. He was on a long bus ride to nowhere. The bus wasn't even air conditioned, and hot, heavy air was almost stifling as the handcuffs. Stanley and his parents had tried to pretend that he was just going away to camp for a while, just like the rich kids do. When Stanley was younger, and he used to play with stuffed animals and pretend that the animals were at camp. Camp fun and games, he called it. Sometimes he'd have them play soccer with a marble. Other times they'd run an obstacle course or go bungee jumping off the table, tied to a broken rubber band. Now Stanley tried to pretend he was going to camp fun and games. Maybe he'd make some friends, he thought. At least he'd get to swim in the lake. He didn't have any friends at home. He was overweight, and the kids at his middle school often teased him about his size. Even his teachers sometimes made cruel comments without realizing it. On his last day of school, his math teacher, Miss Bell, taught ratios. As an example, she chose the heaviest kid in the class and the lightest kid in the class and had them to weigh themselves. Stanley weighed 3 times as much as the other boy. Miss Bell wrote the ratio on the board, 3-1. Unaware of how embarrassment she had caused both of them. Stanley was arrested later that day. He looked at the guard who sat slumped in his seat and wondered if he had fallen asleep. The guard was wearing glasses, so Stanley couldn't see his eyes. Stanley was not a bad kid. He was innocent of the crime for which he was convicted. He'd just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was all of his no good, dirty, rotten, pig stealing great-great-grandfather. He smiled. It was a family joke. Whatever anything went wrong, they'd always blame Stanley's no good, dirty, rotten, pig stealing great-great-grandfather. All right, next page. Supposedly, he had a great-great-grandfather who had stolen a pig from a one-legged gypsy, and she put a curse on him and all his descendants. Stanley and his parents didn't believe in curses, of course, but whatever or whenever anything went wrong, it felt good to be able to blame someone. Things were wrong a lot. They always seemed to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. He looked out of the window at the vast emptiness. He watched the rise and fall of a telephone wire. In his mind, he could hear his father's gruff voice softly singing to him. Here's the song. If only, the woodpecker's thighs, the back of the tree was just a little bit softer, while the wolf waits below, hunger and lonely. He cries to the moon. If only, if only. It was a song his father used to sing to him. The melody was sweet and sad, but Stanley's favorite part was when his father would howl the one word, moon. The bus hit a small bump and the guard sat up instantly. Stanley's father was an inventor. To be successful inventor, you need three things, which is intelligence, perseverance, and just a little bit of luck. Stanley's father was smart and had a lot of perseverance. Once he started a project he would work on for years, often going days without sleep. He just never had any luck. Every time an experiment failed, Stanley could hear him cursing his dirty, rotten, pig-stealing great-grandfather. Stanley's father was also Stanley Yelnats. Stanley Yelnats' father's full name was Stanley Yelnats III. Our Stanley is Stanley Yelnats IV. Everyone in the family had always liked the fact that Stanley Yelnats was spelled the same frontwards and backwards. So they kept naming their son Stanley. Stanley was an only child, as was every other Stanley Yelnats before him. All of them had something else in common. Despite their awful luck, they'd always remained hopeful. As Stanley's father liked to say, I learned from failure. But perhaps that was part of the curse as well. If Stanley and his father weren't always hopeful, then it would hurt so much every time their hopes were crushed. Not every Stanley Yelnats had been a failure. Stanley's mother often pointed out, whenever Stanley or his father became so discouraged that they usually started to believe in the curse. The first Stanley Yelnats, Stanley's great-grandfather, had a fortune in the stock market. He couldn't have been too unlucky. At such times she neglected to mention the bad luck that befell the first Stanley Yelnats. He lost his entire fortune when he was moving from New York to California. His stagecoach was robbed by the outlaw Kissing Kate Barlow. If it weren't for that, Stanley family would now be living in a mansion on the beach in California. Instead, they were crammed into a tiny apartment that smelled like burning rubber and foot odor. If only, if only. The apartment smelled that way. It did because Stanley's father was trying to invent a way to recycle old sneakers. The next page. First person who finds use of old sneakers, he said, will be a very rich man. It was the latest project that led to Stanley's arrest. The bus ride became increasingly bumpy because the road was no longer paved. Actually, Stanley had been impressed when he first found out his great grandfather was robbed by kissing Kate Barlow. True, he would have pretended living on the beach in California, but it was still kind of cool to have someone in your family robbed by a famous outlaw. Kate Barlow didn't actually kiss Stanley's great grandfather. That would have been really cool, but she only kissed men she killed instead. She robbed him and left him stranded in the middle of the desert. He was lucky to have survived. Stanley's mother was quick to point out the bus was slowing down. The guard grunted as he stretched his arms. Welcome to Camp Green Lake, said the driver. Stanley looked out the dirty window. He couldn't see a lake, and hardly anything was green. That was the end of chapters 1, 2, and 3. I hope everybody enjoyed the story, the first 3 chapters, and I'm hoping that everything work out and I'll go ahead and read chapter 4 the next go round. I want everybody to like, share, subscribe to my podcast. Hit that notification button to know when I go live. Ring that bell for updates on my podcast. All right, if you have a chatter letter that you would like for me to broadcast, please send it to the Chatterbox Letters Podcast, Post Office Box 5556, Lakeland, Florida 33807. You can write whatever you want to write about in your chatter letter. Please keep it clean, keep your words clear and discreet. And please, please don't hesitate to send me your chatter letter. You always procrastinate and send your chatter letter to me today. I don't know what happened to my backup music, but thanks for tuning in.